I started to feel my body take on this different type of quality, like texture, like this sense all of a sudden, like it was starting to freeze almost. So it started from my toes, and I remember this feeling of like something telling me to relax. It was like, relax. And I was like, okay. And it started moving from my toes up my legs. So imagine like when you lay on your arm or your leg and it kind
And
of
it goes numb.
sleep and it
Yeah.
goes, it was that was the sensation, but it was kind of, but I wasn't, it just kind of was happening on its own.
Did it
And
scare you?
eventually it started to, but I also knew that I was ready to die for this. That was how deep it was. Like I was ready to die for the revelation.
Thanks for watching the Near Death Network here on YouTube. My name is Mark Lewis. I thank you for watching our videos, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. And as always, leave us your comments.
Welcome to another edition of What's Death Got to Do With It, our podcast here on the Near Death Network. For those of you joining us for the first time, we examine near-death experiences and spiritually transformative experiences by individuals who then can impart what they've learned on their journeys to help elevate us who have not had these experiences and be able to integrate them into our daily lives to help raise the consciousness of the planet. In fact, death, I think, is being redefined as an extension of consciousness. We used to think of it as a finite state, but now there's enough evidence, not only from academicians and clinicians, but from experiencers to give us a body of knowledge that we can be able to glean some of these insights and integrate them into our daily lives so we can live more productively as a planet and raise the profile of humans as we go forward in this time of our lives. Joining us now is Shaun JaRell, who I had the pleasure of meeting here a couple years ago at the IONS conference in Phoenix. We were sitting next together at the preview of a film, Shaun, and it was very fortuitous, and who knew it would lead back to this point. But thanks again for showing up. And by the way, for people who don't know who IONS is, it's the International Association of Near-Death Studies. So welcome, Shaun, to the show.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here.
So you have had an extensive spiritually transformative experience that started when you were young, very young, inquisitive, questioning things that were in your life. And it led to a nexus point in your life and helped catapult you in a different direction, in not only in your psychology pursuits, but Gnosticism and music creation. So you've got a pretty wide palette of interests that you've created in your life right now. Let's go back and we'll just talk about what a spiritually transformative experience is compared to a near-death experience. Near-death means just that. You either clinically died or you had something that resembled a death experience. Spiritually transformative experience can be meditation-induced, can be apparitions, it can be induced by ayahuasca or other psychedelics. So it's probably more pervasive than the near-death experience. How did yours start?
So I think I always had an openness to the spirit realm when I was a child. I have some very early memories of my life, even as young as a toddler, of being open to that space and having some peculiar perceptions and intuitions about things that seemed, as I got older, I started to see that they were maybe a little abnormal for my age.
For instance, what would be a for instance then?
So like when I was very young, I remember I would see, especially at nighttime, I would see, like I guess you could call them apparitions. I would think of them now as like non-corporeal beings or forces, kind of like in the space around me. A lot of times, mostly at night, is when I remember it would be the most disconcerting. And I remember as a young child, I started to sleep with my door closed because I was so startled by just things I would see in the hallways and things like that. And I never really spoke about those things so much when I was a kid, but I did have a lot of inquisitions that were spiritual in nature in terms of just what was happening. I always had, like I've told you, I had this sense of amnesia and homesickness that I seemed to be cognizant of at a very, very young age, of just this sense of that something was happening before, that I appeared as a young human child, but I couldn't really access that information for some reason. But I always thought that the fact that I was aware that I had forgotten seemed to be a peculiar quality that not many people had. So that was really how it started, was mostly just this kind of extra layer of awareness that seemed to be unique to me at that point in time. That I would ask, very strange questions to my family and parents about the nature of life, the nature of reality, that they were just kind of like, what is this kid? You're like, what is he talking about? Like, why does he think like that? But it was just in my nature. They seemed like obvious questions to ask.
Well, and I think when you look at the spiritually transformative experience and how it really compares to the near-death experience, Dr. Bruce Grayson, who is a leader in this field and has been for several years, has chronicled a Grayson test to see if you meet the markers for a near-death experience. And when you took the test and we went through those results, you scored very highly. So a lot of what you experienced was what near-death experiencers go through as well, without the physical death clinically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think it started with mostly questioning, asking questions, to the point that my father deemed me the but why kid, because I was just so inquisitive and asked questions that a lot of people really couldn't answer. I would say that I always also had a weird kind of relationship to my physical body, in a sense that I always had this sense of like, was there two things here? Like, was there the body and then what I was, or like, were we the same thing? There was always this sense of subtle separation that I wasn't quite sure about. And I think that's a good lead into the experience of my first funeral that I went to. When I
Yeah.
was,
Was
when
it
I,
your grandmother?
my great grandmother is
Yeah.
my father's grandmother, and this was in Alabama. I was about 6, 7 years old around that time. And I had already been carrying a lot of these things, had that openness to the spiritual realm, and also that innocence, that just comes naturally when you're a child. And I remember going to the wake for my great grandmother, and it was an open casket wake. So this was my first exposure to a corpse. And I remember getting up on my tippy toes and looking into the casket and seeing her corpse laying there. And that was a very pivotal moment for me, even at that age, with the suspicions and weird fascinations that I already had about my physical being, of just I guess it was maybe vindicating in some ways, validating that I saw that it was almost like a shell. I was like, okay, so I had never even met this woman. So I never met her while she was alive. But just looking at her, I remember being very like intrigued by the implications. And I can't say I was thinking about this in this kind of language because I didn't have the lexicon for it at that time. But I remember kind of like the impressions in my body, and kind of these maybe wordless observations and questionings within. But I remember looking at her and thinking to myself, okay, so she's not there, or she's not in there anymore. And it was a question of, so do we go inside when we die, or does something that's inside go out there? Like, just those kind of questions. And I remember walking into the bathroom in the funeral home and looking in the mirror and looking in my eyes and looking at my hands and just thinking like, so I'm in there. And then the question was like, what am I? Like, what is that? What exactly um I didn't know what to make of it, but it was pretty obvious to me that I think I needed to find out like more directly what was behind life. And that was just something that came naturally to me. And it's not natural for most people, as we know. It's not, maybe at certain stages of their life, maybe when they're, having a midlife crisis, or they're reaching end of life, or they have a loss in their own life. But I was thinking about these things very early on. I think I mentioned to you before, my Jungian mentor, I'm also training to be a Jungian analyst. She had always joked with me that I was born an old person, because a lot of the questionings and confusion that comes to people when they're approaching death or when they hit a midlife crisis, I was being confronted with these things kind of at the very beginning of my life. And she would always say that's a very difficult psychological orientation to have at that age. But she always said, you know, depending on how long I lived, that it could potentially serve me in a big way as I got older.
Well, I think it really does. And I think you and I visited about this before. But when I was 12, I went to my grandfather's funeral, very similar. He was laying in a casket. It was open casket. That was the prototypical way to present a dead body at that time in our society, and especially with Christian backgrounds, and how you went through this pomp and circumstance of sending them to the next realm. I had the same kind of insight. I thought, but I was older than you, so I was a little bit more mature, but not. And I said, he's not in there. The impetus for life is the soul, right? The body is the vehicle. So you made that line of demarcation when you're 7. So how did that change things for you going forward? And then what was the next pivotal point based on that when you started to really go, you had another occurrence that validated what your supposition was?
So I think it's important to include that I was also brought up in the church. Our church was non-denominational, but it was Christian, a non-denominational Christian biblical church that I grew up in. And there was just always this weird kind of misalignment with the framework that they presented for me. Like, I think on an intuitive level, I would be listening to some of these notions that come from fundamentalist Christianity, traditional Christianity, that just didn't seem, it was difficult for me to make sense of them when they presented their version of God, and their system, as far as like the original sin, and the needing to be redeemed by a blood sacrifice and all that kind of stuff. It was just kind of like, this sounds a little wonky. But when you're a kid, it's like you're kind of just like, I didn't know.
Right.
You do have your intuition, and I deem that now is, I think that I had a very strong, what I call as a spiritual immune system, meaning that there was an element of spirit that was already active in me. So there was kind of like something pushing back against some of this programming, like something was pushing against it. Even though it wasn't, I feel like it was revealing to me as I was aging, my own ability to come to my own understanding and establish my own convictions. And I just always had an issue with hearsay. I really needed to experience things for myself. And I didn't like the notion of living on secondhand convictions, like vicarious convictions. I said, I can't just take people's word for things, especially something as important as this. And it was also the notion of dying being an individual process. It's like, so when I die, it's just going to be me. So I can't really base how I live off of other people's experience, perceptions, and understandings. I needed to develop my own. So, at a certain point, around like 12, I decided to leave the church, and luckily I was supported by my family. My parents were church goers, but they were not fanatically religious by any means. And I think that they found it compelling, coming from a young child at that point, maybe like 12, 13, of my reasoning of why I didn't want to go to church anymore. And a lot of it had to do with what seemed to me to be like hypocrisy, and a lot of like performative purity from the congregation and things like that. Just a lot of like double, like cross wires and stuff. And I didn't like the notion of feeling falsified by needing to blindly obey these standards that just didn't feel like my heart was like rejecting them on some level. So I was very sensitive to that aspect of my experience, even though I didn't have much else to go to in substitute for that. So it just kind of became like you're kind of in no man's land spiritually. And I feel like that led to me kind of being cut off from those spiritual senses that I had really young, because just out of survival, I just had to try to be normal. And I feel like there wasn't normal, and there wasn't a lot of space for those parts of my life in just going through puberty and being a teenager and all those things that we have to do as human beings. So I kind of put this stuff, maybe you could say, on the back burner, just out of the need to survive. And I always had that spiritual proclivity, but I just didn't jive with like what was offered to me in terms of like the mainstream systems that tell us this is how it is. This is the like their cosmologies essentially about like this is what the universe is, how it works, how it's set up. It just was like, oh, like I need to figure this out on my own to some degree. So that was really the motivating force for me leaving the church at a young age, which was around, I say 12 or 13.
So you go along to get along for how long? And then you start to experience other, mystical slash spiritually transformative events that really don't jive with what, yes, Western civilization extols about religious pursuits and spiritual pursuits. How does that start? How does that begin? Does that begin after you leave the Bible college, or was it in the
Well,
interim? Or
so I would say the spiritual faculty, I feel like kind of came back online as the way I would describe it from the way it was online when I was a child. And I feel like it went offline for most of my adolescence, teenage years. And then it kind of burst back onto the scene about when I was 19. And at that point, I was in college in North Carolina, and it was similar to when I was a child on the level of the visual component, which I would describe now as seeing into other layers of reality. I hesitate to use the word realm because I don't want to make it sound too ungrounded. But we do know that humans only have an access to a certain level of the light spectrum, and I think that the spiritual faculty involves a sensitivity to those some subtler layers of the light spectrum that most of us don't have access to. But I think we're all pretty privy to the notion of children having access to some of those levels, and also animals and things like that, and just people who are spiritually adept and spiritually awake often have those kind of perceptions as well. So it kind of burst back into my life around 19, to the point that I ended up leaving school because it was so intense and jarring that I wasn't able to function on a normal level. And that was my initial reintroduction to just spirituality in general, because I kind of had tabled it all totally through high school, of just like not really dealing with anything related to that, even though it was still kind of on my heart. I think I just kind of went into this space of um kind of anger and grief, like toward the God notion, because of this sense of feeling abandoned almost, is how I would describe it. Because a lot of us have a lot of our parental issues, I think, extend over into our God perception of like how we view God. A lot of times we view it like a parent. And I think there was a sense of having been abandoned by this parent. And just as I was exposed to more of the world, as we had our conversation about what happened in 9/11, and how that was a big core memory as well, of just being exposed to like more of the darkness in the world. And just like trying to reconcile that with these concepts of God, like, oh, so this kind of darkness exists, and it's like, so what is God stance on this, like, of allowing these kinds of things to happen? What is it really challenges those beliefs and those perspectives. So I was, it came natural to me to question those things anyway. But just as you get exposed to the world, I feel like you see those frameworks more as ways of coping than actual accurate understandings of reality, so to speak.
So did you feel alone? Did you feel like you were isolated in the way that you looked at things? Did you have a peer group that you could run with that would advocate for you, or no?
No, not in those days. Not during high school. Not at the beginning. I would say when I was 19, definitely not. I was definitely alone and isolated in those kinds of things. And I didn't even speak about them a lot. It wasn't until 19 that I started to open up about that part of my inner life, because it became a matter of life and death at that time. Because at that time, I had always had this issue with suicide to a degree, which is, obviously a vulnerable thing to disclose. But it was because it was more so, I think the suicide stemmed from the homesickness of this feeling of, I couldn't remember what was happening before I was born, but it felt like it was important. And that there was this feeling of needing to get back to that somehow. Or, looking back on it, I needed to reconnect to that while I was here, as opposed to just flat out leaving. But my mentality back then was like, I need something. Like it was just, I had that calling and that longing and that yearning that you hear about in spiritual circles. I think it stems from what in the East they would call like bhakti yoga, which is this devotion to the divine, even though you maybe have been alienated from it. But I always had that longing that seemed to be a unique quality. Like not everyone has that. A lot of people are very compliant and at home in the world, and they find the ability to be successful, and they swallow whatever perspectives they were programmed with, and it just makes sense to them and they just go with it. And that's great, if you can manage that. But it just wasn't my path, and it wasn't in my nature to function in that way. So I really had to reconcile a lot of those things just to make it through, I guess you could say.
Well, and you obviously, we can tell in just a short period of time that your mind's always going. You're always inquisitive. You're always questioning, it's fatiguing. It's overwhelming, especially when you don't have a peer group that can advocate and say, no, this is the way it is. You want to go home because home is home. And that amnesia was directed at all of us. And we talk about this with near-death experiencers. Once you make the plan for this incarnation, however you acknowledge what your role is, you agree to it, even if it's challenging. And then obviously the slate is wiped clean, because when you come down to this 3D existence, it doesn't mimic a lot of those types of potentialities that you have on the other side, right? So, but that's part of the plan. And the consensus is, and I do believe this is true based on thousands of stories that I've read, the consensus is we agree to the caveats about our incarnations, and we're given autonomy within the outline. So that's where your sovereignty still comes in. So if we move down the line with you start to meditate. And I think this really opened up more of that Eastern persuasion for you, which I'm familiar with. And it's basically the nexus is the soul. Right. The impetus for all of us in our lives is the way we carry our souls forward. So start when you started meditating, and then you started encountering a lot of these deities from the Indian mystical traditions, correct?
Yeah. So I went to Bible school after leaving college when I was 19. I ended up I reacquainted myself with the church because that was the only thing I knew at the time. So I think it's natural when you have an awakening to go back to whatever you were initially introduced to. So I ended up going to Bible school for about a year, and learned about the Bible, learned different things, got more into that, but it still wasn't satisfying, I guess you could say. Like it wasn't really reaching that part of me that was like, where there was no resonance. It was more so like I was looking for a certain kind of resonance that is not just, oh, I want to believe this, or I want to think this is the truth. It was more so like I needed to feel it in my being, that like my being is agreeing with what I'm seeing. And I just was looking for that level of vibrational agreement that I just couldn't find in fundamentalist Christianity. So after Bible school, I did, that was when I discovered meditation, and was exposed to, at the time, I believe it was Nisargadatta Maharaj, his famous book, I Am That. And I just,
pretty deep.
Yeah, I started meditating, and it seemed to be, even though I had never done it before, it seemed to come very naturally to me.
Familiar, huh?
Yeah, almost like riding a bike to an extent. And I think we discussed previously the notion of, reincarnation. And there's a notion in Eastern understanding that spiritual work from previous incarnations sometimes carries over to the subsequent incarnation. So there was that sense of, like, have I done this before kind of thing? Even though I hadn't done it yet in this life, there was a sense of some part of me knew that how to do it, or how to, just like what that space was like. And it came very naturally to me. So yeah, I did start meditating, probably in the fashion of Nisargadatta style, which was meditating on the I am, is what he called it. And like Ramana Maharshi called it self-inquiry, which is constantly questioning, who am I? without answering the question using language or concepts, and just feeling that presence of oneself and meditating on that and letting that essentially become your guru. I had done a lot of that by just naturally. And I started to have some peculiar experiences in those 2 years following Bible school. And
For example,
for example, I know them now to be called things like satori and samadhi, which are states of like intense concentration that are connected to spiritual opening, awakening, growth, and kundalini surges and things like that. Not that I had this understanding at the time, but looking back on it, I can now see that that's a lot of what I was experiencing, because I was starting to kind of accumulate some of this spiritual energy just through meditating. But I really just wanted to experience what was true for myself. I couldn't just believe something because someone told me. I said, I need to experience it for myself. And that desire was so fiery for me. It had a lot of gravity behind it, to the point that, because I was always kind of disillusioned by what this world had to offer. I was never under the impression that any of the things I was presented as goals in this life had any real substance. It's like they have their place, their practical value, and like that's fine. But I knew that wasn't it. Even as a child, I remember observing a lot of adults who followed the trajectory that was presented to them, the template of convention of what's expected of you, what to achieve. And just I remember making that distinction, that I was like, yeah, but these people are still not, they don't have it. And I don't know what the it was, but there was almost like there wasn't a fulfillment in people that I would view as like a spiritual fulfillment. Even if they go to church, it was more so of just this like doing what you're told. But
rote.
yeah,
Rote.
yeah, but there wasn't a sense of like resonance. Like for me, it wasn't until I encountered some of these Indian mystics that I experienced the resonance that I was searching for, which was like, oh, they have it. Like they've accessed whatever it is that I'm seeking. Because I didn't know really what I was seeking, but I felt like I would know it when I felt it. And being exposed to them, like Osho and Ramana Maharshi and Paramahansa Yogananda, people like that, reading about them and their experiences and their journey of awakening, I was starting to make a lot of parallels. So these samadhi experiences, it would just be moments of like such intense concentration, to the point that I felt like I no longer even had control over it, if I ever did. But there was times where my attention would become so concentrated in one area. A lot of times here, like kind of like in the middle of the eyebrows, sometimes in the navel, sometimes in the chest. That was the sense of it, that it would go through, it was like a process of refining the attention, and it would move to different areas and kind of hover there. That's my sense of it. It's almost like it was reorienting my whole energy field, is
Your pathways.
how I would describe it. Even though I didn't know what was going on, all I knew was to maintain that attention on the I am, as Nisargadatta would call it. And then there was a sense of I was communing with something. That was how it would feel. Like, oh, something is responding to me doing this and reaching for these things. I felt like, and some of the biblical notions did start to make sense in terms of things like ask and ye shall receive, or seek ye first the kingdom of heaven and all else shall be added unto you. Those kind of things started to make sense because I was seeking this stuff, to the detriment of what I'm supposed to be seeking in the world, as far as like worldly success. I was still working and going to school and doing those basic practical things, but this was where my heart really was.
Well, can you talk about, I can't recall which individual, which one of the Indian mystics presented themselves to you as, what we would characterize as an apparition, but as you said, and very eloquently, that everything's frequency, everything's vibration. So whether it's a rendering of holograms, whether it's an individual in the flesh, it's immaterial. It's the communing that you had with that individual. And then talk about how deep you were into it, because you missed work. You just went through an entire day and totally forgot about it. I think that'll really solidify it.
So you're referring to the Kensho experience, the Shavasana experience, which was at the beginning of 2014. So this was almost 2 years after I had gotten more deeply into the meditation. It's about a year and a half, almost 2 years. So at the beginning of 2014, you know, I was still deeply into meditation, reading as much as I can from the Indian, the Eastern philosophies, just trying to learn and understand. And there was one specific experience. This happened in early 2014, and this was what I understand now to have been a Kensho experience that had a Shavasana component. So
What
to
is Kensho and Shavasana?
Kensho, the Kensho experience, I believe is the spiritual experience of like the void, like the direct experience of like the emptiness of things, the void. And the Shavasana component is Ramana Maharshi had a Shavasana experience when he was like 16 that led to his awakening, which is it has to do with a corpse like experience of oneself. So the way I would describe it, I was meditating before work one day, and I worked at an auto shop at this time. So I was in my car waiting to go into work, and you know I was meditating like I always was, because I wasn't the kind of person who just like sat down to meditate occasionally with my eyes closed. It was something that I really was doing at all times as much as I could, just always kind of having that focus and that alert attention. So what happened? So I'm sitting in the car waiting to go into work, and I got into one of these really deep trance concentration states, and I started to feel my body take on this different type of quality, like texture, like this sense all of a sudden, like it was starting to freeze almost. So it started from my toes, and I remember this feeling of like something telling me to relax. It was like, relax. And I was like, okay. And it started moving from my toes up my legs. So imagine like when you lay on your arm or your leg and it kind
And
of
it goes
falls
numb.
asleep and it
Yeah.
goes, it was that was the sensation, but it was kind of, but I wasn't, it just kind of was happening on its own.
Did it
And
scare you?
I, eventually it started to, but I also
Mhm.
knew that I was ready to die for this. That was how deep it was. Like I was ready to die for the revelation, which is what I always viewed the suicide thing was. It was like I need you to reveal to me what is life, like what is this? Like what is the purpose? I don't know why I care so much, but I can't just be normal like everyone else. It's just not in my makeup to just walk around like none like it, I needed to know. Um, and I couldn't just ignore that proclivity because it was so strong. But so it was this experience of this numbness moving from my toes up my legs, up my body, and I'm sitting in my car and it goes up my neck, and now I'm just frozen, and it goes up to my face, and now I'm looking around and it's just my eyes, and then it goes past my eyes, and then my eyes closed by themselves. So that was the thing that was a little bit frightening, was that things seemed to be happening by themselves. Like I wasn't doing it. I was more so witnessing it, observing it from within, but I wasn't in control. So there was definitely an element of surrender that came from that. But as it got to my eyes and my eyes closed, I had this sensation of being sucked forward and like kind of falling forward, but then expanding. So it was like my sense of like that sense of yourself that you have when your eyes are closed, like that feeling that you have when you first wake up, where you know that you're there. Like, oh, I'm back, I'm awake. It was that sense of self. It was like expanded outward into the environment around me, like because I was in a parking lot. So like just the whole surrounding environment for like several miles, I could feel the environment as if it was myself. It was like I became the entire environment, and there was this woofing sound, like a womp 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 kind of, like a. I describe it now as it was. I think it was the om, what they describe as the om. But I had this sense of being everything around the environment. And like I had this tactile, which is kind of similar to what they describe in near-death experiences when they're watching things. It kind of felt like that. And this went on for about an hour, where I was just in this expanded state with this woofing sound, and feeling like, I remember thinking when it was happening, that inner space, I'm like, okay, now we're getting somewhere. So I don't
Mhm.
know what's going on, but like clearly something is happening. So this went on for about an hour, and then eventually that sense of expansion, it contracted back down to the dimensions of my body, and then slowly my eyes opened and I started to get the feeling back in my limbs, and I felt like a newborn baby or something. Like my whole body felt like just raw, like kind of like raw in a way that I wasn't used to. It was like, wow, almost like the sensory part of me had just been like wiped
Like
clean.
cleansed.
Yeah, cleansed something. And then I remember I got out of the car. I got out of the car, and as soon as I stood up, I just fell to the ground, like fell to my knees, like I had never stood before. It was like I almost hadn't even walked before. It was just like everything about my body felt brand new, and I was like, what the heck was that? What was that? I was like, but okay, I guess I'm tapping into something. Something is responding to me. And it never felt like evil or like scary or anything like that. It just felt, there was something natural about it, but it also felt like, oh, like something is responding to my seeking. That was really how it struck me. It was like, okay, this is actually, I'm getting a response to my inquiries on a spiritual level. So that was early 2014. Now we're talking about the visitations. This takes us to about August of 2014, which is about a month before my 22nd birthday. So this was when I started to enter the 24-hour tacit awareness, where things got pretty strange. And I always like to prelude this with that in the Western medical model, 24-hour tacit awareness, especially for days on end, would be considered a manic or psychotic state. And I don't like to sidestep that because that is a fact. But I do also want to acknowledge that the Western medical model has its limitations, as we know, especially when it comes to certain spiritual traditions and shamanic systems that view those things in different ways, that would view a period like that more as an initiation rather than like a psychotic break, so to speak. So this went on, this was probably like the end of August, and it went on for about 2 weeks, where I entered this state where it was just 24-hour awareness. Like
What does it feel like?
think of just 24-hour unbroken awareness. So it was, so when my body would go to the sleep stage, I would maintain my full awareness. It was almost like the body, I would know when the body's telling me, okay, it's time to sleep. But it was more so a sense of like rest, not sleep, because I was still awake. But I would know it because the body would get kind of heavy. And there was a sense of the breathing would change in a way that was very noticeable to me. Like if you've ever been in the room with someone while they're asleep, how their breathing has a certain kind of rhythm.
Cadence to it.
Yeah, it's deeper and it's different than how someone breathes when they're awake, with the ego presence is there. But when the ego is not there, when we're asleep, the breathing is much fuller. It's much deeper. So that was how I would understand that I was entering into those states, because my body would start breathing like that. And I just kind of would surrender to it, like, okay, because there was a pleasantness to it as well. Like there was a feeling of I understand maybe why they would call it bliss. I don't really like that word personally, but there was definitely a pleasurable quality to that state of the sleep state, but being fully aware. I think this is what they call the Turiya in Eastern, which is the fourth state, which is sleeping, waking, dreaming, and then the fourth state, dreamless.
So would you say that's contingent on surrender?
And
I don't mean surrender as we view it, which is kind of a negative connotation,
right,
but to be able to suspend all of the antiquated beliefs that drove you away from the model that didn't resonate with you.
I do think that it requires a certain kind of openness and a certain kind of, like what they would call in Zen, a beginner's mind, which is you don't carry a bunch of beliefs. Like you don't carry a bunch of insistences about what reality is.
You're open.
Yeah, I had an openness, like, I don't know. It was like, but I would like to know. I would like to be shown directly. I wasn't just assuming, the Christian, I could have brought the Christian framework. This is what it is. Or any of the Eastern frameworks. I could have brought them, but the Eastern framework was a little bit more encouraging that openness and that personal exposure, which Christianity really didn't. It was just like, just believe what we're telling you. Don't worry about it. Don't ask questions. And I just, that doesn't work for me. So I was like, okay.
It's kind of like what parents do, right?
Of course.
Don't question me. You just can't do that. Well, why not? It's fun. I mean,
right. To get into the politically engineered component of Christianity and why they don't want you to ask questions, but that's another conversation. But But
So which one of these mystics was most prominent in how they presented themselves to you? Because that was very compelling, I thought,
right.
from having dabbled a little bit in their studied self-realization, which is Yogananda's
Mhm.
discipline significantly. And in fact, he laid uncorruptible for almost 30 days.
Yeah.
And he said that would happen. He would do that to show that the body is not the impetus for everything. The impetus is the soul. So
Right.
anyway, we take a little side route there, but let's get into that because we're talking about your spiritually transformative experience so people can get a picture of what you were going through.
Right. So going back to those 2 weeks, there was a lot of different things that happened during these 2 weeks, but I want to focus on two particular experiences, and then try to describe some of like what it was like. So there was a sense of having that openness to the spiritual realm heightened to like an extreme level. And there was times where I felt the presence of what I would describe as malevolent forces, negative entities, non-corporeal entities. The way I would describe it now was almost like my, I think my frequency had got to such a peculiar state that I was almost attracting these things, almost like moths to a flame. Almost like, oh, this one's getting a little too bright. And it was like I was drawing attention to myself, is what it felt like. Accidentally. It was only because I wasn't really eating at that time. And like I described it to you, it felt like a period of involuntary fasting because I never said to myself I'm gonna fast, but it just kind of this deeper energy was kind of just carrying me along, and certain appetites just kind of dropped off, like they just kind of like disappeared. It was like they became unimportant, and like food for those 2 weeks, it was just I barely ate. I think I lost a lot of weight too at that point because I just didn't care about it. I don't care about eating, and sleeping didn't really matter much either. It was I would get into these drowsy states, but I wouldn't sleep, so to speak.
So, how did you dispense with the malevolent forces? In other words, you talk about frequency and resonance, and I totally buy into that. I really think it's a sense of. So, the sense that you project is what you attract. If
Right.
you have negativity, you bring that resonance into your space.
Mhm.
So, how did you delegate and get rid of that part of it, and then just focus on the true aspect of the soul?
So I think that there was elements of perhaps resonance with my own shadow material that I may have not been aware of at the time, that was resonating with these negative forces. There also was this sense of just them being attracted to snuffing out someone who's maybe starting to shine a little too much, kind of at that. This makes sense. But what I got from them was there was we need to stop him, or we need to there was a sense of them trying to make me act out or do something that almost would derail my process of development. That
Is
was how
that when the suicide ideation was prominent,
um
or
to a
was it after?
degree. I mean, at that point, I'm in the thick of it. I'm kind of just like, okay, I'm getting somewhere. This is what I was asking
So
for as
you're
far
pumped.
I'm kind of just like, okay, like, yeah, like show me. Like, let's like if we're going, let's go then. But I need you to just like help me understand, because it wasn't just the exposure to negative forces. I've also described to you there was a exposure to what felt like but benevolent forces, positive forces that I call the white robed beings, because that's how they had presented themselves to me at certain points in time. And there was also this sense of them communicating to me, trying to educate me on what was happening and how to deal with it. So the two of the experiences I want to get into at that period of time, one of them was the inner light experience. And that took place because I'm still meditating heavily during this period, just trying to maintain my center. And there was one day I'm meditating, and I'm sitting in my room with my eyes closed. And the only way I can describe it is there started to be this like flickering from within my face, kind of like behind my eyes. And as I'm sitting with that flickering sensation, eventually there was this, it was almost like a additional pair of eyes from within my physical being kind of rotated upwards. Now my physical eyes are still closed, but this other pair of eyes rotated up from within, and I could see with my physical eyes closed, but from within my body. And there was a light within that seemed to have almost like flicked on, and I could look around like this and I could see everything, and I looked down and there was just this like almost like a sun was like within me. And I'm just like, what is, it was a life-changing experience. And I connected back to the identity crisis of my childhood, of like, what am I? Because I had never experienced that light within myself in that way. But it also made sense of Jesus is the kingdom of heaven is within you, and also that you are the light of the world. I remember a lot of those phrases would come to me in those moments, and all of a sudden it had personal meaning. And that was my thing of I needed to make these things personally meaningful to myself based on my own experience, not just regurgitating them because that's what I was programmed to believe. So that was a big experience, was the inner light. And then the other experience that I want to get into from those 2 weeks was obviously the visitation, is what you were referring to. And that happened one night, middle of the night, again, not really sleeping, but I would get into these like kind of drowsy trance kind of states and kind of doze off for a second and like wake up. And at one point that happened and I'm kind of dozing off, and it was like a few seconds and I jolt awake, and all of a sudden there's a man standing at the foot of my bed in my bedroom. Obviously, it was like kind of jarring. And was like, okay, I'm like, what's going on? But I recognized him immediately as Osho.
Tell people who Osho is.
Osho is a controversial, I want to say he's a very controversial figure, even though he also emitted a lot of beautiful spiritual understanding in his life as well. But he was very rebellious, very provocative in his belief systems and his approaches to certain things like sexuality and stuff like that, that he rubbed a lot of people the wrong way, especially in the West. When people come with the Christian upbringing, Osho was very radical.
Is he still with us, or is he transitioned?
No, Osho transitioned even before I was born. He was
Okay.
he passed, I want to say, in like 1990 maybe, so a couple years before I was born. But I recognized him immediately, him standing at the foot of my bed, and there was a communication that came from him. There was like a waviness around him, similar to like what you see in the distance on the road on a hot day, like that kind of like fizzly feeling. And it emanated from him and came towards me. And when it passed through me, I heard him within myself. It's like his mouth never moved and he never spoke, but almost like he communicated from within him to within me, telepathically, if you want to use that term. But what he said, the phrase has always stuck with me. It was almost like etched into my mind. And he said, I would like to continue my work through you. Do I have your permission? So the big thing was the permission component, because the negative forces were very invasive, very intrusive, and never considered. You could see that there was no consideration for my own sovereignty and my own choice. There was just a sense of them throwing things at me, like projecting things, whatever. But Osho had this sense of, do I have your permission for, like, I'm asking you? And it also resonates as like part of Joseph Campbell's The Hero's Journey, of like the beginning of you getting something being brought to you and you feeling like maybe you're not worthy of it or whatever. So he communicates this to me and I just nod. I remember because of how it felt. It felt like, okay, like him and I are coming from the same place. I think that was really the kinship, and the vibrational alignment. There was this sense of what really matters to me in life is what mattered to him. And that's why he's showing himself to me, because he's like, you care about what I cared about. Even though people didn't understand me when I was alive, we're on the same wavelength. And that's why I'm showing myself to you and why I think you're a good candidate to continue my work. And now, however that looks is obviously up for debate. And I'm not saying that I'm
right. No, you're articulating your experience, and people can either accept it or not accept it.
Right. But there's an egoic component behind it of like being special or chosen or something like that. But this is just my life. This is just what happened, what I went through, and how I've had to try to make sense of it. So I nodded to him and said, I didn't say anything. I just nodded. And then he nodded and then he disappeared. And that's not the last time that he appeared to me. He's appeared to me couple other times after that, but that was the first time. And also during that period, I told you I had the visions about my future. Supposed, I think it was potentials for my future, but that was
Hmm.
also a big component of that 2 week period. Was I was shown things about my life, and I also missed sharing that that 2 week period started with the question, again, getting into a little bit of despair at that time. The question that I asked that led to all of that was, I said, "What do you want from me?" Though I
To
think
God.
to God, to
Yeah.
life, whatever.
Yeah.
That was the question, and it came from a place of, I'm really not interested in anything that this world has to offer. Like I kid you not, I'm not. I don't care about any of it. Not really. It's like I'm not looking for fulfillment from anything that this world can offer me. But if there's something that I'm supposed to be offering, it would be helpful if I could be clear on that. It's like, why am I here? Like, what am I supposed to be giving something? Like, what is it? Because I'm clearly not just like everyone else in this way. Like, I'm not just like, I can't just like, play
Go
along.
along to get
Yeah. So
along.
I was like, what is it? Like, what am I here for? So that
Yeah.
was really how this period started. And it felt like a direct response to my question. I said, what do you want from me? And then all these things started to happen. And one of them was this experience of, I saw that I was in the vision that I was shown, I was an 11 times platinum selling recording artist. And I was traveling, speaking about these things, sharing the story of it, and it was being very helpful for people. And I was like, oh, like, and it was felt like a direct response. This is what I want from you. This is one of the things I want from you. And I'm like, okay, like, it was, I wasn't like super gung ho about it, but I was just like, I mean, if it can help people, I'll try.
Sure.
It's like, I'll try. It's like, if that's the only thing that really seemed worthwhile to me, it's like, if I can alleviate some suffering for people on some level, I will do what I can to do that. But I'm not necessarily looking for anything in particular, like an idyllic situation. Of course, we all want to like make money and have meaningful work and stuff like that. But for
Right.
me, it was more, it had to come from a certain place within myself that I was still trying to.
Self-fulfillment and service is what I'm getting. Self-fulfillment and service. So you want to do something that resonates with what you've always felt internally, that's never been validated, only in glimpses, but
Right.
you wanted more of a concrete path.
Mhm.
And you were shown, yes, you'll do this. And you're studying Jungian psychology, so you can be a really good help to people that are, and there's a lot of despair on the planet right now.
Of course.
If you're on the left, you hate the right. If you're on the right, you hate the left. But old systems need to crumble before we can rebuild with the correct resonance. And we don't want to get too esoteric,
Of
but
course.
to go from the third dimension vibrational pattern to the fifth is a quantum leap. And we've identified these things with quantum mechanics and the ability to access them now. But let's talk, because I know your music is wonderful. I haven't had a chance to listen to the last one that you just sent me, but I listened to everything else before that. It's very well produced. It has a really nice resonance to it.
Mhm.
And how can people sample your music, and how does that dovetail with what your mission for Shaun JaRell is in this lifetime?
Well, my understanding of the music was that it was meant to I think, capture some of this energy that I was accessing within myself, to capture it and almost serve as almost like a beacon for other people to attune to their version of that energy.
Like a
Um,
facilitator.
Essentially, or like a transducing kind of antenna quality, because that was my understanding of it. Was, okay, so the world is in the state that it's in, humans are in the condition that they're in. I had this sense of, I used to think that the only thing that, because I used to think about, we talk about God being all powerful. So why don't you just reveal yourself to everyone? It was like, it's
Right.
like, he was like, why don't you just, because it does reveal itself to certain individuals, but it was like, you could just reveal yourself to everyone and like we could just move on from all this craziness. So my sense was, if I can at least make my contact with that force, if I could give it some kind of concrete form, that other people can listen to it. Because I had someone tell me literally yesterday, someone reached out to me who heard the new album, and they said, I'm listening to this, and I feel like I'm getting into a higher consciousness just listening to this. And that was very reassuring, because that's what I'm going for, is that when you listen to it, you kind of can attune your antenna to that force and see what it wants from you. Because my sense is that that's the only way to live a truly fulfilled life, is that you have to have your connection to that, and that let it live through you in your version of that. It's not a sense of uniformity, but I think that so many people are so pressured to live in a conformity to the templates that we're given societally, that people are not able to ever access their dharma, so to speak,
And
which
what
is
does dharma mean?
dharma is,
Your life's purpose?
for lack of a better term, it's more so living in alignment with what the nature created your organism for. That each organism was created with a certain creative potential in a certain area or a certain line of work. But a lot of us don't ever access that or discover it, because, we have to survive here. And a lot of
Right.
times it takes stillness and time to sit with yourself to discover it. And I think that's also part of the design of the pacing of our world, is that people never have time for it. And except for when you get to a place, if you've checked off all your boxes economically and professionally, and now you have a little bit of time, and then people get into spirituality then. So I had a privilege in that way, to be able to answer this call out of the support of my family and my background, that I was able to explore these things and find a way to what is my contribution to the world that is not being a regurgitation of it. The question I always ask myself is, in what ways am I contributing to the things that I hate about the world? And it's like, I hate this. I hate people who act like this, people who value this. It's like, so how can I show up in a way that's in alignment with what I really value, not with what the world values? And a lot of that has to do with just being a decent human,
Right.
but having a scope that is inclusive and cosmic, not just local and egoic and
Well, it's
identity.
the golden rule. I mean, it's as fundamental as my mom is very Christian and not fundamentalist to where she's oppressive, but she always articulates this, and it's very simple. Treat people how you want to be treated. Now, that doesn't mean you let people run over you. And you had said, a couple minutes ago, why doesn't God reveal him or herself or itself? I think God does reveal itself every moment of every day, because we are that divine spark of God.
Mhm.
So what God says is, here's your outline. You have full run of the entire space of consciousness. What you elect to use is up to you.
Mhm.
Everything is in your domain. But like you said, when we look at the constraints that the world puts on us, and we think, God, if I do this, then they're going to think I'm psycho, or I'm out of my mind, or a sportscaster's doing near-death shows, and now a Jungian psychologist is talking about meeting an Indian mystic. I mean,
Oh,
what
yeah.
the hell is this, man?
It's pretty robust. It does.
Yeah. So rather than go to what do people think of us, if you come with the intent of purity and elevation of everyone within your sphere of influence, there can't be anything bad with that.
You would think, but humans have a way. Like, we have a way of corrupting just about everything, it seems like. But but there's also, you made a good point about, like you said, the systems in the world. And in biblical thought, they would call it like the principalities. And I think that is a real thing. In Gnosticism, they would call it the archons, which is just the energies on the planet that try to keep us from
realizing our spiritual
from these
destinies.
revelations that are
Yeah.
constantly trying to deceive us about who we are and about what truly matters. And people find their way through it, and there's a lot of those themes run through all spiritual traditions. There's a lot of different ways of describing, I think, the predicament that we find ourselves in. And just from culture to culture, they have their own cultural presentation for the same reality. But in the different traditions that I've studied, there's a lot of commonalities and similar themes if you can look at them archetypally and symbolically rather than literally. And
Right.
the danger is taking things literal, but some
Right.
aspects of them are literal because the inner light was literal. It wasn't just a symbol. It's like, no, that's real.
Right.
Then you come to realize that you're in the dark most of the time. So,
Well, but that was done to validate what your quest was all about. Your
for
quest
sure.
was, I know there's more than this. I
Mhm.
want to get to where there's more than this. I want the answers. And you were steadfast, and you had a lot of pitfalls, and you fell. But that's the story. That's the hero's journey that Campbell talks about. You know, anybody can handle a good time. You're not having impediments thrown in your way all the time. You don't get in your own way. You don't acquiesce to what society's norms of you. You live genuinely and authentically. And I think that's not always easy, but it's always the productive route, right? So we need to tie this up, and I'll put the in the show notes, I'll put, you know, how they can get to your music, how they can get to you and identify with your ongoing pursuit. But we always want to end with, what's the so what? So you've had all these experiences. No one else has had them like you have. How can you articulate comprehensively to the broad audience who's out there questing themselves, perhaps to find their place in this, it looks to be a chaotic world? What is the so what of your experience?
I would say, from my perspective, the so what of why these things are important is because I think it's important that we establish our own convictions when it comes to these topics that are based on our own insights and our own experiences. I think that there is a danger to just inheriting things without critically analyzing them
And
and
questioning.
unpacking them. And
Yeah.
a lot of people are afraid to do that because there is a period of time where you're kind of in no man's land, and some people are not. They're not. It's not comfortable, and I went through it for a long time of not knowing. I just not knowing. As Eckhart Tolle has said, that it's important to become comfortable with not knowing in order for answers to reveal themselves. You have to be able to sit with not knowing, and I did that for a long time. I don't know. I don't know. But as that state kind of established itself, these experiences started to happen, which were answers to a lot of my questions. And I've developed my own understanding and my own framework. And now I just can share that. But it doesn't mean that it's objectively true or that it's true for everyone. But I think that everyone has the capacity to come to their own conclusions. And I think that it's important when it comes to how we treat each other. Because when I see the widespread immiseration of people and just the way that people act out of their misery, I think that misery comes from living out of alignment with one's dharma. That the misery is because you're not living in alignment with what was really being asked of you, and you never had the courage to address it. And I think that that is what's really important, is addressing what is being asked of you other than just the practical needs of survival. It's like, because your circumstances demand whatever they demand, depending on what you have to do to survive or who's dependent on you or things like that.
Right.
But at a certain point, like you have done in your life, you carved out a space for the metaphysician aspect of yourself. Like you still did your regular work as a newscaster and all that, but you had this part of yourself that was calling you to metaphysics, and you made space for that. And I think that, as I'm sure, has affected you as a person, how you've grown, how you relate to people, your emotional intelligence, your spiritual intelligence, all those things are combined. So I think that's what really matters about it, is that people come to their own understanding of these things. And as the quote goes, the theologians of the world may quarrel, but the mystics all speak the same language. So when people have their own experience of the spiritual realm, and they're not just gripping tightly to some beliefs that they were taught, you come to see that a lot of people come to the same conclusions about what is important in the grand scheme, and that everyone is entitled to whatever makes sense to them, because their individual path is theirs and they have to be allowed to walk it. And I think that's why uniformity is so pushed on us, because they don't want people to awaken to their own individual calling. Because if everyone did, we would live in a different world. Because
Well, the jig would be up then.
because
The jig is up, and we know that you have an
people wouldn't
ulterior motive.
Yeah, people wouldn't tolerate the systems that we live in, and they wouldn't feel compelled to mistreat each other. I think maybe that's idealistic, but that's the conclusion that I've come to, and that's the place that I come from, and try to encourage other people to find in themselves.
What's your web address so people can get a hold of you?
So you could Google Shaun JaRell, which is on the video, ShaunJarell. If you Google it, all my music and stuff will come up. That's also my Instagram and Twitter name. I'm not super active on social media, but I do post my music when the new music comes out, just so people can access it. And then I also have a link to a website on my Instagram, which is just a link to an academic publication, a previous interview I've done, several music stuff that I've released, and yeah, that's pretty much it at this point.
Well, you better put this interview on there.
Oh yeah, I will. Absolutely will. Absolutely will. I mean, it's the first of its kind. So hopefully maybe it's the first of many.
Well, I think it's an honor for me to be able to talk to you, because I know I've been in your position, and it took me a lot longer to get to where you are. And I didn't have all the same idiosyncrasies that were influencing your decision to basically be forthcoming with your experience. But there's a lot of us out there, and it does take a village. And collectively, people will identify with me or you or both of us authenticity, because again, I think it does, like you said, gets back to resonance. Where is your heart? What, where do you want to place yourself? Are you self-deprecating? Are you someone who comes with service as a purpose? I think you can see those, and you can see through the people that are going strictly for an ulterior motive. And my teacher gave me a great way to handle those people. He said, well, just say that's unbelievable, because what you're saying is, I don't believe a word you're saying, and you're anesthetizing yourself to their point of view. You don't believe it, right? But they are placated because they think you're acknowledging their position. So what you're doing is you're giving yourself an out rather than argue with them, and you're not going to change their point of view. And these interactions are more seldom and seldom as we come out and authentically state who we are in the world. We resonate with people like ourselves, and we get together. And so the people who need to hear this message, in my mind's eye, will hear it. And the people who don't come to it won't. I mean, it's that simple.
Exactly. And that's totally okay. Like you said, every drop in the bucket counts.
Thank you so much, Shaun. I always appreciate visiting with you, and best of luck going through. Stay in touch with us and let us know how the music goes.
Absolutely. Maybe we'll do another interview.